Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. This is Paul Wlodarczyk. I'm with easyDITA. Joining us today is Sarah O'Keefe from Scriptorium. Right now, we're conducting a poll for the next minute or so while people file in. If you could just take some time to answer this poll. Are you using or planning to use DITA? We'll use this information to tailor our presentation today. And Sarah will be starting in about 1 minute.
I'll be there.
So Sarah, I can see from our poll so far that about half the people joining us today are just learning about DITA.
And that sounds about right. I think maybe more surprised at seeing that a quarter are already using it in production. But welcome aboard, everybody, and we'll look forward to an interesting discussion here. At least I hope so.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap the poll up here. So we're going to close this poll, and we'll look at our results, and we'll get started with the broadcast. So it looks like about 44% of you, just a little under half, are just learning about DITA, and about a fifth of you are looking to plan a pilot soon, which is great, or doing a pilot now. And we've got a good quarter of you are already using DITA in production right now, and hopefully you all will learn something good about content strategy. I'd like to introduce Sarah O'Keefe. Sarah is the president of Scriptorium. They're a partner of ours. And Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. I am happy to be here and talk about two of my favorite topics here. So I appreciate the venue, and thank you to those of you who are, let's see, staying late at work, giving up your lunch hour, or possibly, up in the middle of the night, depending on where you might be located.
We're blowing off meetings if you're in California, so thank you for joining us.
Blowing off meetings if you're in California. Well, we don't thank them. That's, they thank us for providing a way of blowing off meetings. So this is the first presentation in the DITA Rockstar Summer Camp that easyDITA is putting on, and we'll have a little bit more about that later. But they have I get to be the opening act for a truly amazing lineup that they have coming down the pipe. So keep an eye on that, because there's definitely some really good stuff and some really interesting presenters coming in this series of events over, summer in the Northern Hemisphere for the Aussies that are on the line at 4 in the morning or whatever it is there. All right, so my name's Sarah O'Keefe. I run a company called Scriptorium Publishing. We are a content strategy consultancy, and we're particularly interested in content strategy in technical communication as opposed to, for example, Marcom content strategy. Now, perhaps they shouldn't be bifurcated that way, but they are right now. I have a book out called Content Strategy 101, which is focused particularly on issues around TechCom and content strategy. But my interest over my career has always been in this question of how content and publishing and technology kind of intersect. So that's really where our consulting efforts and our business is focused. The exact nature of what we do has changed over time. I would also like you to know that I'm wearing exactly that outfit and makeup. Really? Maybe. Probably not. Okay. So question A then is, what is content strategy? And for this presentation, I've decided to make a travel analogy. Content strategy is when you're planning a trip to go from point A to point B, and you need to figure out how to get there. Now, when you apply this analogy to content, then your strategy is figuring out how to connect your business goals to content. That's the simplest definition that I've found. So within an organization, what are your business goals, and how can you use content to achieve those business goals? So not just what content should we develop, but why that content? How should it be developed? How should it be managed? How should it be delivered? And what impact will the content have on the business? So the idea is that your content gets you to achieve your goal, which in this case appears to be to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the most important thing that you need to take away from this presentation is that tools are not content strategy, okay? I'm going to travel in a submarine is not your strategy. Your strategy is things like, I need to get across the ocean without anybody noticing. And a submarine would be a good way to achieve that, possibly, but it's not your strategy. So from a content point of view, your strategy is going to be something like, we really want to improve our brand in the marketplace by providing up-to-date technical content. We want to provide a spiffy mobile experience which supports our marketing team's assertion that we are nimble and cutting edge. That's a strategy. So when you start thinking about strategy, the question is, what is the goal of your trip, right? Is it to move cargo? Is it to map the bottom of the ocean? Is it to get from A to B as fast as possible? Is money a concern? Because if money is not a concern and you want to go as fast as possible, the answer to this problem is probably to charter a private plane. But if you're concerned about finances, and we nearly always are, then you're probably not going to get to take the most direct route. So for content, you ask questions about, how fast do I need to deliver my content? How important is it to deliver quickly? How important is accuracy? How important is completeness? How important is time to market and cost? So what are the factors that govern your content development and that constrain the strategy that you're going to choose? I think everybody would probably agree that the two most pleasant ways of getting from the East Coast to, I think Rome is roughly where I put that dot, would be either a private plane or, you know, some sort of luxury cruise ship, assuming you don't get seasick. But in reality, you're going to do things like connect through London Heathrow, which is, I'm not totally sure which circle of hell it is, but I'm pretty sure it's one of them. Okay, so back to content. When you start thinking about content and what are your business goals? Your business goals drive your strategy and your implementation. So here's a business goal: create information required by regulators. If you don't meet the regulators' requirements, you will not ship product. That's a really straightforward business goal. You could say more specifically that you want to deliver the content efficiently, or you want to deliver the minimum required by regulators, you know, and sort of sneak it through there. You can do things like choose not to meet the regulatory requirements, save some money, and hope that nobody notices. Now, that doesn't sound like the best long-term strategy, but it is actually a strategy, right? So if you have regulatory issues, how are you going to deal with those? Your strategy might look something like this from a business point of view. We want to increase our market share in BRIC countries. BRIC is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And explore TIMPS countries, which is the new acronym. So TIMPS is Turkey, Indonesia, Mexico, and the Philippines. Well, let's talk about that from a content point of view for a second. First of all, when your executives blithely talk about BRIC countries, so Brazil means Brazilian Portuguese, Russia means Russian. India, well, are you going to deliver in English, or are you going to deliver in the various Indic languages? Are you delivering into the villages, or are you delivering to major cities? That will govern what you deal with there. China, now you're talking about Chinese. Similarly with the TIMPS countries, Turkey, Turkey does have just one language generally, and Mexico. But Indonesia and the Philippines, Indonesia has something like 700 languages that are in use. Now, there are one or two that are widely used across Indonesia and have hundreds of millions of speakers, but that's not going to cover all of Indonesia for you. Nothing will. In the Philippines, you might assume, oh, well, we'll just assume that people can read English. But is that your market? Is your market the people in the Philippines who can read and speak English? That's a subset of the total Filipino market. So for content, you have to ask this question of what's the best way to support these countries? Your strategy is going to be different for different types of products. Selling to large businesses in emerging markets is different from selling to wealthy consumers, or different from selling into every single village in a given country. So you really have to think about this carefully from a content point of view. Maybe you want to increase your visibility in the marketplace and makes people aware that you exist where they have not been previously aware that you're out there. Most often when we say we want to increase our visibility in the marketplace, from a content point of view, what this means is making your content available on a public-facing website and doing some work around keywords and metadata and search engine optimization. Now, every time I bring this up, people say, oh, we can't do that. Our content is locked up in a customer portal. You have to log in and you have to sign on. And the usual reasoning for this is, well, you know, we have to do it that way because our competitors might get it. They might get the information. Now, I have a couple of problems with this logic, assuming or stipulating, first of all, that we are not talking about some sort of content that actually legitimately needs to be secret. So if you're in the intelligence world or if you're documenting something like security for nuclear power plants, then that is one thing. If you are in very nearly every other industry, then your competitors are going to defeat your sign-on. I mean, they can just buy your product and get documentation that way, or they can do something slightly more nefarious. But I would assume that any competitor you have that is reasonably competent already has your product and your product documentation. And, you know, when people push back on this, I would ask the question of, well, do you have your competitors' stuff? And they always look really sheepish and go, well, of course. Okay. So if you lock up your content behind a sign-on, what that's going to do is slow down your less competent competitors and lock out your non-customers. And I don't think that that's a trade-off in general that is appropriate, with some obvious exceptions. So what you want to do is establish your business goals and then figure out how to connect those business goals to content. How do you accomplish those business goals in the content context, which is where you're operating? If you have a lot of languages to support, you must have an efficient content development process. If you would like to have better technical support, better, more efficient technical support is your goal, then you need better content that is more searchable and broken down in ways that make sense to the tech support people. If you've run into a scenario where tech support is unhappy and has started writing their own content because they hate what you're providing and or it shows up too late, then go and have a chat with tech support about why the content that you're producing is not meeting their requirements and how to improve it to do what they need. Nearly always the answer is we need it faster and we need it more searchable and we hate your 800-page PDFs. 800-page PDFs are pretty much the bane of tech support's existence. All right, so we need to establish some goals. We need to set them up with the content. Next question, is DITA a content strategy? And the answer to this is, of course not. DITA is perhaps a tool or a collection of tools or an architecture, but it's not a strategy. It doesn't have anything to do with your business goals. It's just a thing. It's no more a strategy than, you know, I'm going to use Microsoft Word as a strategy. So DITA is an architecture. It lets you do certain things well. It's good at single sourcing, it's good at reuse, and it's good at content exchange, and it's good at producing lots of different formats. And I would argue it's also good at efficient localization. Strategy is when you decide, to go back to my ocean crossing analogy, strategy is when you decide how fast do I need to get there, and therefore do I need a plane or a ship. So strategy is when you decide that in order to support your business goals, you need single sourcing, reuse, content exchange, efficient localization. Then you're going to look at the question of, does DITA make sense? But not beforehand. Your strategy depends on your requirements. If you have to go to Mars, your requirements for aerospace projects are very different from your requirements for a backyard air-powered rocket. And the requirements always need to come first. Unfortunately, what we see so very often is that people decide on a solution, they do their research, and they say, ooh, this is cool and I like it and it's fun. And then they try to cram their strategy into the solution that they've already chosen. So people call us up and say, I'm having trouble with DITA. It doesn't do a very good job of producing, you know, high-end textbooks with arbitrary formatting on every page. Well, yeah, no, it doesn't. That's not what it's for. So why are you using DITA to produce textbooks with arbitrary formatting? And we can have a conversation about whether that formatting is really necessary, whether we can work around it or what. But what they're doing is they're trying to cram the solution or the strategy into the solution. You need to do it the other way. First question, what are your deliverables? What are your requirements? What's your strategy, and what deliverables are needed to support that? And then what can we use to actually do that efficiently? What are the appropriate tools given the requirements? So question A is, what are you trying to accomplish? And the answer is not give people user manuals or even give people content. The answer is something along the lines of sell lots of product, or sell lots of product in this country, or maybe something like save the world. So get the ring to Mordor and throw it in the pit of fire is kind of the goal that we're going for here. And it's probably worth pointing out that Hobbit survival was kind of optional in this scenario. So how can your content support your actual goal? And keep in mind that the survival of your preferred way of life is probably not the goal that we're going for, right? That may not be an option given what you're trying to accomplish. You need to think about what your constraints are. What are the project constraints? So for instance, your corporate policy may be to favor open source software. In general, we want you to use open source software. That's a constraint. We prefer everything to be built on SharePoint. That's a very sad constraint. Corporate culture is important, and I think people maybe overlook this. Is your company an early adopter or a late adopter? Do they occupy the cutting edge of new technology? How well do people adjust to change? How often do you have change in your organization? These questions all factor into your decisions about what is my strategy going to be. So it's not just about picking the best strategy, it's about picking a strategy that will actually succeed within your organization. So for example, given a company that is, very, very invested in certain kinds of technologies, and SharePoint might be a good example of this, trying to then swim upstream with some sort of an open source solution that's going to require a whole bunch of configuration and a lot of, web guys that do open source stuff, that might be the best technical solution, but it might not be a good fit for that organization. So you have to worry about the corporate fit. And that goes beyond just the question of the best technical answer. It's, can you sell it within the organization? In addition to your constraints, you want to ask some questions about special requirements. Now, every organization that I go into, we ask about requirements, and pretty much everybody thinks that their content is special and unique, and it's a snowflake, and nothing else is out there like their stuff. And it's true, but it's not true. So the difference between a special requirement and a regular requirement is kind of in the eye of the beholder. But well, while crossing the ocean, I need to map the bottom of the ocean and look for U-boats would qualify as a special and or unusual requirement. Most people crossing the ocean are not concerned about that. So what kinds of things do you have perhaps that are unusual? And what I would look for here is questions around regulatory issues and compliance. If you have an organization, for example, that in the past has been engaged in litigation around certain kinds of patents or intellectual property or various kinds of things, then it's probably going to be the case that the legal team is going to be extremely concerned about those kinds of issues, more so than in a normal organization. Complex global requirements. We don't really bat an eye when people say we have 20 or 30 languages. But when they say we have 80 to 100, now we're talking about a scenario where there are, that's an edge case relative to how many languages most other companies are doing. Or perhaps there are languages in there that are particularly interesting. Ancient Greek comes to mind. We did a project around some classics content, and we had to deal with ancient Greek. And it turns out that you run into some really, really interesting font problems that are not normal font problems. If you were working in Arabic, you could have a similar problem of classical Arabic or sort of older Arabic versus modern Arabic. And there is something called modern standard Arabic, but let's just set that aside. So complex requirements that are not common are going to be things that will set you apart, because for one thing, a lot of your tools and technologies will not accommodate those complex requirements because nobody else has had them. So you're going to be unusual, and unusual is not where you want to be. Extreme versioning.
So one thing that we've seen is an unusual requirement or special requirement is getting your content into a system. And that we're encountering that a lot more. I think if your content needs to not only live in documents and deliverables, but it needs to live inside of some sort of system, especially a system that's yours, that's unique to you, that's absolutely a special requirement. That we've seen that come up a lot in the last 6 months to a year.
Yes, and so system integration is a huge problem. And there are a couple of ways that can happen. What you're describing, I think, is we want to author our stuff in, for example, easyDITA, but we want to push it out into something else. Maybe it's Salesforce. It could be all sorts of things. So that's one problem set. The other one that we're seeing an awful lot of is essentially the reverse, which is we have a system that contains some data, and we want that data included in our documents. So now you're talking about something like SAP, that has a bunch of content in it, like parts databases, and we want to extract from that and include it in our deliverables. So you have this integration problem that you run into. So yeah, that one tends to be really, really expensive and complicated. And the other one I have here is versioning above and beyond what I would describe as the norm. In the olden days, we used to say that if you had conditional text and you turned it all on in your unstructured FrameMaker document, and your document lit up like a Christmas tree, that was a bad sign. Similarly, if you have versioning that is just really complicated and just a lot of it, and it's all over the place, more so than just a paragraph here and there, then that's something to consider and worry about. But yeah, content integration is a really, really good requirement, and it is going to be unique, right? Because it's going to be that particular organization's database, which means by definition it'll be unique. Now, as you move forward with this, I think it's important to make sure that you've thought carefully about all of your options, including the ones that seem a tad exotic or not so apparent. You should not just default to a solution that you are familiar with. You should do your research and figure out what your options are. And conversely, the inverse of don't default to the solution you're familiar with is don't default to the new shiny object because it's shiny. Now, I personally think that having dolphins with cameras as part of my content strategy would be the greatest thing that's ever happened in my life. But, is this actually the best solution for what I'm trying to do? I don't know. I'm not clear on what the constraints are for the camera dolphin mounting project. So there's always this temptation to say, well, we already have X tool, or we already know X tool, so let's just use that. Well, is it the best solution? Does it do what you need it to? Have you built out your requirements and mapped it against your requirements? Now, it is legitimate to say, we already have this tool, we already have expertise in it, it's going to be a lot less painful to use it. That I don't have any problem with. But you can't just say, you can't put on the blinders and have this tunnel vision of what can our current tool do. You have to really understand what are your options, what's out there. So consider all your options, but don't get too distracted by the shiny object. You have to have executive sponsorship. These projects are not small, and if you don't have executive sponsorship, you will be limited to basically tinkering around the edges of your existing workflow. That may be acceptable. If your current workflow just needs a little tweak, then okay. But if your current workflow can't handle the requirements that you've identified, you're going to need to do something drastic. Drastic usually means expensive, and I don't mean necessarily cash expensive, but resource expensive. And if you're going to do that, you have to have executive support. So now we're back to do a strategy, do the requirements, get executive sponsorship. And as part of this, you'll need a business case. You have to prove to the executives that this is a good idea and it will improve business operations in some way. The preferred way of doing this is to prove that they will save a ton of money. They like that. It makes them happy. The second most preferred way of doing this is to prove that they will get more revenue. They like revenue. So executive support is critical. Now, you don't have to do this right away. You don't have to do this while you're doing your research, but at some point you have to go and talk to the execs, or somebody has to go talk to the execs and say, this is what we need to do, and here's why. That can be a pretty painful conversation. Now, you really want to think about the size of the problem that you have, and how sophisticated are your requirements? Are you going out for an afternoon sale, or do you require something a little more, industrial strength? How big a solution do you need? And that's a hard question. It ties in some cases to the return on investment, to the ROI question. If you can pretty easily show that, hey, if we buy the cruise ship, we can save hundreds of thousands of dollars, versus, the other way, we just can't do what we need to do, then that would be okay. And I have to say it's getting better. 5 or 10 years ago, I got an awful lot of phone calls that went, I really want a CMS. Okay, well, why do you want one? Well, they're cool. Yeah, okay, that rarely works. It rarely works to go to your executives and say, I want this cool thing because it's cool. You have to, you have to really understand why you need it and be able to justify it, and be able to justify it in words that they understand, which usually start with, we can save X dollars. Euros also work, and other currencies, but we can save money, and this is how. That's what they want to hear. Now, what happens if you don't have a strategy? In a small project, what will probably happen is nothing. You can do your thing. You can tweak it around the edges. You can do what you need to do. You can tinker, and you can make it work, and that will be fine. But if you're doing something industrial strength, if you're trying to, to take this analogy, transport 2,000 people and feed them 8 times a day, then you really do need a full-on strategy of doing this right. So from a content point of view, the more content you have, the more languages you have, the more deliverables you have, the more complexity, the system integration that Paul mentioned, all of those things point you towards needing an actual strategy. If you don't have an actual strategy, you're going to have big-time problems. Now, that brings us to the other really interesting question, which is, can you have a content strategy without a CMS? And the answer to that is yes, of course. A content management system is a tool. Tools are not content strategy. So, of course, you can have a strategy that does not involve a content management system. However, there's a really good possibility that your requirements are going to make a workflow without a CMS unreasonable. I mean, it is apparently possible to row across the Atlantic Ocean. I looked it up. But it takes a really long time, and apparently people die on a pretty regular basis. So you might not be able to do what you need, and you may not. I know I don't have the wherewithal to actually pull this off, right, physically, or I don't want to. I would prefer not to try. I'd like to get on a plane. So can you have a content strategy without a CMS? Yes. But the more interesting question is this: can you meet your requirements without a CMS? This is really a much, much better question. So first, what are your requirements? What are you trying to do? What do you need to do? Then, what does your solution need to look like? And realistically, if you have requirements that go beyond the very basic small projects, then yeah, you're probably going to need a content management system. The human brain is really good at a lot of things, But keeping track of where thousands and thousands of files reside and who updated them last is not one of those things that the human brain is good at. And the number 2 way that people do this, which is Excel spreadsheets, is also really terrible. So can you meet your requirements without a CMS? That's the question that you have to answer, which brings us back to what are your requirements? Now, tying this in with DITA, we ask the question of, okay, so I'm working on my strategy, I'm building out requirements. At what point do I look at my requirements and say, you know, I think based on these requirements, I should consider a solution that involves DITA in some way? These 4 are the big 4 that you're going to want to look at in terms of DITA. Topic-based authoring. If you're creating topics, then that's what DITA does out of the box. So if you need topics, DITA might be a reasonable answer. If you need localization, and especially if you have a lot of it, you want to take a look at that. It has really, really good support for localization, localization management, kind of all the things that go around that. Reuse at various levels in your document. If that's something that you need to prioritize, you're going to want to take a look at DITA. And also if you have lots of output formats. So if you need to create some content and then generate it into lots of different formats, then you may want to take a look at an option that's based on DITA. If you're only pushing into one format and you're never going to need any other format, then, then maybe not, because it starts out format neutral and then lets you specify which outputs you want. So these are the kinds of things that we look for when we're assessing this question of, is DITA a reasonable fit for a particular client and a particular set of requirements? Now, having looked at that question, the other side of that question is, what are the risks of DITA? What are the downsides? And these are the 3. And I led with change management for a reason. The biggest risk that you have with DITA is that it tends to be a major change from what people are currently doing, and most people hate change. The people who don't hate change are consultants. The rest of us, or the rest of them, sorry, the normal people don't like change. So it's a major change. Within that major change, there are technical challenges. It requires a level of technology that is much higher than what most content organizations are accustomed to. So I'm talking about a scenario where there's some outright scripting and programming that needs to be done to get DITA to bend it to your will. That is a concern, especially in small organizations. Now, the third challenge here, which is perhaps actually the biggest challenge, but we talk about this one a lot, is writing. People who are not familiar with writing topic-based authoring are going to have significant difficulties with DITA. Now, I would argue that if you've reached this point as a technical writer in your career and you're not at least familiar with the concept of topic-based authoring, we've got some major issues. But it's very, very common to have large organizations that have been producing monster PDFs for the past 20 years, and the same people have been doing it for the past 10 or 15 years, and they've never been exposed to anything else. Moving them into topic-based authoring is a huge challenge. Also, writing for reuse, writing consistently, getting all those things together, those are all big issues. But the key here is the change management issue. If you can solve that, you can address the other 2 and you'll be okay. But change management is where these things founder, if they're going to founder. So the major advantages that we have are that DITA meets the sort of typical TechCom requirements. Now, I'm not saying it meets your requirements. I'm just saying it does a good job of meeting a class of requirements that are pretty normal. It's an open standard. This is a huge plus. For anyone that's ever had to do any sort of document conversion from Format A to Format B and has suffered through the nightmare that is, which, I'm not sure it rises to the same circle of hell as London Heathrow, but it's up there. It is just so painful. So having an open standard is a big deal because you can always take your toys and go home. And there's significant vendor support. So lots of vendors, including easyDITA, offer support for DITA. And that makes it potentially a more pleasant and a more, an easier experience than trying to configure a set of tools for a custom content model. Now, if you have a compelling reason to do a custom content model, we can talk about that. But hardly anybody does. A lot of people think their content is special, and then you start digging into it and you realize it's really not that special. It's quite typical in terms of what's out there and what kinds of stuff that they've produced. So the burning question, of course, is DITA right for me? Is it right for you and your project? And the answer to that is, as always, it depends. I don't know. Does your content fall into the sort of class of regular tech comm? Will DITA solve the kinds of issues that you're looking at? Can you handle the change management? Can you deal with the technological challenges? If so, maybe. But start with your requirements. Start with your business goals, work your way through the requirements, and then from the requirements, figure out what sorts of things you actually want to implement and figure it out from there. Okay, so with that, I have a couple of slides with some additional information, but Paul, I think I'm about ready to take some questions and see what's out there. This webcast is being recorded. The slides will be available on the easyDITA website. All those of you who are registered will receive a link by email. The upcoming webcasts in this series will be on the easydita.com website, and we at Scriptorium also have some upcoming events, which are at scriptorium.com/events. I'm going to put up the contact information. And Paul, do we have any questions?
We don't. We do have somebody that has their hand raised, and if you have a question, please use the question panel and the GoToWebinar question. I see a couple of hands raised. So just type your question in the question panel for GoToWebinar, and we'll answer your question. Or if you can't find the question panel, just type it in chat, and we'll find it either way. And so, Sarah, I've got a question here as well while we're waiting for people to submit some questions. How do people get started doing a content strategy? I mean, what's the first step?
Well, so step one is understand your business and your business goals, and work your way over from there. Once you have your goals, you can sort of build out your requirements and your strategy. We do a lot of this work with customers. Recently, a lot of the people that call us up have already done that work. They've done the legwork. They understand. They've decided, usually, not always, but usually that DITA is appropriate, and they're trying to figure out, okay, now how do I take the next step, right? Because they're not ready to spend a couple $100,000. Actually, they're not even sure how much they'll need to spend. They're just sort of in this position of, okay, we think this is going to work, but we don't want to say it's going to work and then have it not work, and then very bad things happen. One thing that people may not be aware of is that Paul and I, which is to say easyDITA and Scriptorium, have something called a quick start, where essentially we do a pilot project with some outputs and some transforms and some style sheets and maybe some help with strategy coming from Scriptorium, and with a pilot version of easyDITA coming from the easyDITA side. That can be potentially a lower risk way of jumping in rather than going ahead and doing, a full-on, we're going for it, we're going to implement, we're going to spend all this money. So that might be something to consider.
Yeah, and what we see with people that are looking at a quick start, they usually have a pretty specific goal. So they want to prove technology, or they want to prove that DITA is right as a content model for their content, or they want to understand some of the change management issues. So we usually set pretty specific goals for those quick starts. And they tend to run, they're price fixed, and they tend to run 60 to 90 days. So you get a good answer in terms of, is DITA right for me? We do have some questions that came in. There's some great questions here, Sarah. One that I saw from Steve is, we really want to understand if DITA is the correct solution for us. Is it appropriate for a small documentation shop with 5 writers?
Maybe. So it is very difficult to make a case for DITA in a one-writer shop. Let me start with that. And if you have 50 writers, you can probably show enough efficiency that you can justify it, assuming that you have the kind of content that makes sense for DITA and the kind of requirements. So I'm going to assume that this person is basically saying, our content is appropriate for DITA. Now we're just trying to figure out, can we justify it given 5 writers? Okay.
Yeah.
So it depends on the amount of content you have and the amount of localization and the amount of reuse. So and formatting. So I would look in those places. If you're doing a lot of localization, start there, because that almost always can be quantified because there's a localization vendor and it has an invoice attached to it. A bunch of languages almost always equals a business justification for DITA on cost, on localization cost savings. So I would start there. If you don't have localization, then you're going to have to look at potential reuse and savings off of reuse, and formatting efficiency and savings off of automating your formatting. You're going to want to look at the question of how much reuse are we doing or could we be doing? What's the delta between the two, and how much is that worth? And then the other question is going to be, how much time do the writers spend doing formatting versus if they were in DITA and they could push a button and get their output? How much is that worth? How many hours will that save? So, 5 writers is a small group, but it's not a tiny group. So it's, it's possible. And maybe even likely if you have localization. If not, you're going to have to look a little bit harder.
I actually wrote a blog post on this last year about it. Are we too small for DITA? And we had a LinkedIn conversation going in several of the LinkedIn groups about this. We found, in fact, we count among our customers a number of very small shops with 5 or fewer writers. And the thing that's interesting about that, we also saw that there were a number of very small shops that responded to our State of Collaboration survey last summer that are using DITA in production. One of the things we found in the dialogues that we've been having is the thing that drives small shops to use DITA is collaboration with their subject matter experts when they've got an effective set of tools for doing that collaboration. And in fact, that's why a number of people that are in very small shops have come to us. They've got maybe 5 writers, but they might have 25 software engineers that are writing the core of the documentation and contributing it to those writers, or writing policies and procedures content in business functions and then contributing those to a publication shop for management and publication. So we're seeing collaboration and also search and discovery as primary reasons beyond the cost savings that are driving the small shops to use DITA.
So you have to look beyond just the 5 writers.
Yeah.
How many contributors do you actually have?
Yeah. And how much time do you spend reformatting the content that's being contributed into the process? So we've got a bunch of other questions here. Let's go with a question from Aunt Davy, who asked, Sarah, do you have a paper outlining why SharePoint is a sad requirement?
Hi, Aunt. I don't. SharePoint. SharePoint is a document collaboration system. It is not intended for managing components such as DITA topics, and when you try and make it do that, it becomes very unpleasant very quickly. So this is one of these working as designed, not being intended as designed, and not being used as intended.
Yeah, and we have a number of customers that I've worked with, at easyDITA and before easyDITA that are authoring their content in DITA and then publishing it to SharePoint for document management and distribution, where they use SharePoint as an intranet. So I think it doesn't scare us to see SharePoint as a delivery vehicle. We've seen people use that very effectively, especially when they do information architecture and content strategy for SharePoint. And so they've got taxonomy, metadata in SharePoint for making the information more findable.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction, right? Authoring versus delivery platform. I don't think anybody has a particular problem with delivery platform.
So Kathleen asks, do you have any recommendations for winning over writers who are change averse?
Sorry. So somebody asked me maybe a year ago, they said, now, do you ever do any change management? And I said, it's all we do. It's not we're not technology consultants. I mean, we are, but our most difficult task is dealing with change and winning over people who are change averse. So there are a couple of ways of doing this, and it depends on your writers and kind of where they are in their thinking. But there's a couple of ways of attacking it. One is to say, look, we have executive buy-in. They think this is cool. They are paying attention to us, the tech writers, for the first time in the history of ever. This is a huge opportunity for us to shine. That's one option. Another option is to simply appeal to their motivated self-interest. Okay, I know you think this isn't the greatest idea in the history of ever, but look around at the industry. Lots of people are moving in this direction. Having XML and a CMS and DITA on your resume is going to be a good idea, even if you hate what we're doing here. So, simple self-preservation is an option. I've seen some more manipulative approaches, such as forming a pilot team and only letting the people that think new stuff is cool be involved on the pilot team and making it a privilege. In fact, I think one organization went so far as having a test that you had to pass before you were permitted to go and work in the spiffy new environment. And what they did was they split their writers into two teams, the basically legacy maintenance team and the spiffy new cool writing the cool stuff team. And there was an implied message that if you're on the legacy team, that work is going to dry up over time, so you might want to, over the next couple of years, think about moving yourself over to the other team. Most writers, not everybody, but most writers will respond to a discussion of, we need to deliver for mobile, we need to do this, we need to do that, and we've thought this through, and this is how we're going to do it. So you appeal to a sense of professionalism and professional pride, and this is the direction that it's going in. In some cases, once you get down into the tools, you can win over people by showing them new features, and collaboration is a good example of this. If you can show people a collaborative review feature that is going to make their lives really a lot easier, the writer's life, then that may be enough to convince them that this thing where they print out documents and walk them around the building begging people to sign off is, is not the most fun thing they do every day, and this would be an improvement. But those are kind of the three angles that I would start with, and there are others depending on what kind of writers you're dealing with.
Yeah, and I have to agree that having a pilot project where one group of writers working on a project, implements DITA's, soup to nuts, or at least enough of it to do real work in it, and then has a showcase and shares with the rest of the organization what was in it for them. Because usually for the writers, what's in it for them is they find that they get to focus on their content, they get to focus on their writing. And this is going to dovetail to a question and comment we got from Annette, who says, I think the goal of writing is communication, and part of communication is formatting in ways that best suit the need of the end audience, right? So not having the ability to format concerns me. Can you?
Okay, so when we say, and I've picked up an echo. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so when we say not having the ability to format, what we're talking about is taking away the ability of a writer to arbitrarily tweak their formatting as they are authoring a particular piece of content. Now, in most cases, we're already not allowed to do that, right? We've had templates for a long time, and most organizations say, here's the template, and you will follow it, or else. So when we go to structure and DITA and XML and all this other stuff, all we're doing is abstracting that template into an enforceable layer. So you author in a word processor-ish environment, and then when you push the button and say, make me online help, or make me a user guide, or make me a website, or whatever the deliverable is that you're creating, it automatically applies the proper formatting for that specific deliverable to your content. So we do have the ability to format, it's just that we don't have the ability to break the formatting rules at our convenience all the time, although there are, at least in theory, ways of getting around that. I would also argue that people say, oh, DITA output is ugly, and inarguably the default output out of the DITA Open Toolkit is not very attractive. It is, however, quite possible to configure that and make output that is perfectly reasonable and is formatted however you want. I tend to get the make it look exactly like this question, and then people hand me stuff that is just horrible PDFs, and they want it, reproduced exactly. And I'm looking at it thinking, why would anybody want their document to look like this? Because it's just yucky. So we can format, we just can't do arbitrary formatting unless we do some creative things. But yeah, you would certainly have formatting that is appropriate to each medium if you put the work in to set that up.
Yeah, we've got a customer right now that's publishing their DITA into InDesign, actually, because they do need control over the final layout, where their documents, actually in this case, are textbooks, and they're heavily formatted. But they love the ability of being able to author their content in DITA and have it go to multiple destinations. But in this particular case, for one type of deliverable, they want tight control and manual layout, and they're flowing the content into InDesign. So in cases where that's an absolute requirement, it's possible, but in most cases, people love the ability of letting the writers and the subject matter experts focus on the content and the semantics of the content, being able to say this is a user control, this is a button in the user interface, versus saying bold, italic, underline, or whatever font you want. So the semantics are there, and they get to be used for other things besides formatting, like search. Sherry actually commented on this, and she said another way to think about formatting is that you don't lose the ability, you gain the ability to have the experts determine the format. I like that comment a lot. I think that captures it.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Let's see here. Quick question from Bill. Are we aware of DITA being used in schools that require APA formatting? And I'm not familiar with APA formatting. Is that something you've come across, Sarah?
I do not know what APA formatting is, so I'm going to say no. If anyone else has that information and would like to email it to Paul or myself, I will make sure that Bill gets the answer. APA, American
Psychological Association. Thank you, Sherry.
Psychological Association. Yeah, no, not aware of that. So.
There's a couple folks commenting in. APA Style Guide. APA generally refers to reference formatting. So we'll take a look into that, and we'll get back to Bill, who asked the question. We'll get back to you with an answer in the next few days. Another question here. Why is DITA less expensive for localization? And that's from Annette.
So now I'm going to paint this in broad strokes, and I'm going to have to overgeneralize. In general, when you go for localization out of InDesign or FrameMaker or Word or anything like that, you ship off your documents to the localization people, and they send you back a translated document in Word and a bill, an invoice. The invoice that they're going to send you is going to break down into translation. This went from English to German, and this is what we charged for the linguist to do that actual word by word or sentence by sentence translation, and formatting. Because what you run into, as infamously as you know, is that from English to German you get text expansion of about 30%, so your formatting doesn't work anymore. Your table widths might not work, or the word note becomes a much longer note. A much longer word, so you have to adjust how that's formatted, that type of thing. On average, your localization bill is going to be about 50% linguistic and 50% formatting, roughly. Now, it varies, but in an unstructured workflow, it's typically a 50-50 split. If it's in design files, it'll be higher. It'll be like 60-70% formatting. And if they're in design files that are set up badly and don't use templates, I don't even want to talk about those. Okay, so your invoice comes back from your localization vendor for $100,000, of which $50,000 is word translation and $50,000 is formatting. On the word translation side, the cost justification for DITA is based on the idea that you will have more reuse which means more translation matching, which means more translation leverage, which means fewer individual segments, sentences, to translate. That is usually an incremental improvement. It's rare for that to be a really, really huge improvement, although it can be. On the other side, on the formatting side, you go from a scenario where they translate everything into German and then go through the Word file page by page, fixing all these nasty things that happen and cleaning them up and correcting them. In a DITA-based workflow, you're going to ship the DITA files, the XML, and then they're going to translate that. And then when it comes back, you're going to push a button and say, give me this output in German. And it's going to automatically do all the formatting that's appropriate for German and swap out all the strings and do a bunch of other stuff. So instead of having a bill that's 50-50, that second 50% of formatting will go down to, it should be 0, but let's call it 5%. So that means that on a sort of $100,000 translation bill, instead of $100,000, your next invoice in a DITA workflow would be more like 55 or 60 because you don't have that formatting work. That's the general answer. My numbers are, obviously made up, but that's the argument for localization.
And we've seen between reuse and avoiding the desktop publishing charges, which end up being most of the localization bill, and in a lot of cases with unstructured document, we've seen, I can almost guarantee that you'll get 40% to 50% savings. We've seen savings as high as 80 to 90% from improved leverage on localization memory. So it depends on your content and how much of it is one-off, but if you're a platform-oriented product company, whether that's software or hardware, where there's a lot of content that's common across product platforms and across product variants, you'll see that savings get up above 50 pretty quickly. One of the questions we had here is, what is it, and this is a great question, how much would it cost to implement DITA? And that's from Heidi.
Hi, Heidi. Long time no see. I'm tempted to say, how much money do you have? And that's not quite as flippant as it sounds.
That's the vendor answer, right?
That's the vendor answer. Well, it's actually a serious answer almost, because the first question is, what are your requirements and what does your business case look like? That drives how much money you can spend. Now, if going into DITA means you spend, $50,000 less on localization per 100,000, and you're doing $1 million a year in localization, you're talking about saving $500,000 in localization per year. So at that point, you can spend an awful lot of money to get it right. If you're the aforementioned, 5 writers, maybe not so much localization, just some reuse, then clearly you need to scale this to cost less. We did some research a couple of years ago. We have a report out called The State of Structured Authoring, and we asked exactly this question: how much did it cost? Now, those numbers are highly, highly suspect because we didn't have people break it down. We didn't ask for CMS versus not CMS, all these kinds of things. But we asked for ranges. But with that caveat, the answer was about $100,000 on average. That sounds about right. We've done it for less. We've done it for a lot more. Sometimes the answer is a couple $1 million. Sometimes the answer is you can do it for, 30.
No, I would agree. I think if your requirements are very straightforward, you can do it for 30, absolutely. But $100,000 is about the middle of the range for implementing DITA. And we're coming up in the top of the hour, so I think we got time for one last question here. Sarah, did you want to pick one from the question list?
Well, I liked there's a follow-up to this, which is, what does the 100K include? I'll try and give you an idea of this, but again, this is so situational. The way we break that down typically is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Roughly 1/3 of that is going to be tools and configuration, CMS, style sheets, authoring tools, those kinds of things, and configuration. 1/3 is going to be training, getting it up and running, getting people up to speed, training, that kind of thing. and 1/3 is going to be content migration. But to ask the question, when I say 100K, what does that include? Well, for some people, there's no CMS involved and includes a bunch of stuff. For other people, that's, they're not doing any content migration and they spend their money in other places. Some people have 6 or 7 different outputs in 27 languages and they spend over $100,000 just getting all their outputs up and running. So it's very hard to answer that question, but 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 seems like an almost reasonable rule of thumb.
Great. Well, Sarah, thank you very much for this webcast. This is great. Everybody that had a question that we didn't answer, we've got all the questions recorded, and we'll try to get you answers to those questions via email to your specific questions. We've got all your email addresses. You will all get, the number of people asked if a recording was available. Absolutely. Recording will be available, and if you know anybody that didn't attend, they'll be able to get a copy of the recording in the next day or so. We'll send out a follow-up email. Thank you for attending, or thanking you for registering, and with a link to the recorded webcast. And we will also include you all in an email for the next webcast, which is coming up. And Steve, that is? That is on June the 12th. June the 12th, and it's with Joanne Hackos.
That is Joanne Hackos.
Yes.
Yeah,
so
cool stuff coming up.
Cool stuff coming up all summer, and actually we're scheduled. This is turning into the ongoing series for DITA Rockstars. So I think we're booked all the way through October right now with our Rockstars. So watch our website and watch your inbox for invitations to the future and upcoming events. And thank you all for your time and your great questions today. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. You're entertaining and informative as always. So thanks for spending the time with us. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.